Trump campaign is now reaching voters online.
You are seeing the President of the United States. Look at the lines.
You joined our movement.
A lot of President Trump supporters
The
here.
greatest movement in the history of our country. I'm fighting for you, and I love doing it with everything that I have. And I will never, ever stop. We are one people, one family, and one glorious nation under God. We will make America great again.
Welcome to Team Trump Online.
Ready to go?
This is a crisis.
This is no time for Donald Trump's record of hysterical xenophobia.
Biden's son inked a $1 billion deal with a subsidiary of the Bank of China.
China is going to eat our lunch? Come on, man. They're not bad folks.
Since the outbreak, the Communist Party has been mobilizing overseas organizations to buy local supplies and send them to China.
It is in our self-interest that China continue to prosper. What a beautiful history we wrote together. Banning all travel will not stop it.
The president is right. That travel restriction on China, as every public health official we've talked to said, bought the country time.
That was a very smart move right there.
Hysterical xenophobia. Dear mine. Xenophobia. I complimented him on dealing with China. I'm not going nuts.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Team Trump Online's War Room Weekly, where we take a closer look at President Trump's excellent record of achievement on behalf of the American people and contrast that with Joe Biden's record of failure and terrible ideas for the future. I'm Tim Murtaugh, Communications Director for the Trump 2020 campaign. Thank you for being with us. And before we get started, I would like to remind everyone to, a little bit later on this evening, stay tuned on Fox News to watch President Trump's special town hall. It's called America Together, Returning to Work, 7 o'clock Eastern Time on Fox News. But for right now, we're on War Room Weekly, and we are very pleased today to be joined by KT McFarland, former Deputy National Security Advisor to President Trump. KT, thank you very much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
And also with us, as always, Mercedes Schlapp, Director of Strategic Communications for President Trump's campaign. Mercy, good to see you.
It's great to see you too, Tim.
And it is fitting to have KT McFarland here because we're going to be talking about foreign policy, and that is an area that will be oh so very important to the United States and to the world over the next 4 years, depending on who the next president is. We can go one direction or another. KT, you were right there in the White House with President Trump and every day dealing with him and his view of the world. Tell us, how does President Trump view the United States in relation to the rest of the world in global politics and global policy?
You know, Tim, this is actually quite revolutionary, which I think most people have overlooked the fact that Trump has reversed 20 years of American foreign policy where we were being exploited. And a little bit of background to this. At the end of World War II, the United States didn't want to fight World War III, and we wanted strong allies and trading partners. So we turned to our allies from World War II and even our adversaries, and we helped them. We helped rebuild their economies, often at the expense of our own, and we underwrote their security alliances with us. So we subsidized, Japan, Korea, all the European countries. And we did so with the idea that once they got on their feet, they would be strong allies and trading partners. And it worked brilliantly. The problem was, and this is what Trump understood, which no other president did, and no other leader really in either political party, he understood that the time had come to put America's interests first, to recalibrate those agreements, to go to our European allies and say, you've got to spend more on defense, to go to our Japanese and Korean allies and say the same, and to go to our European allies, trading partners, and our trading partners all around the world and say, we have underwritten your industrial development and manufacturing base for long enough. You're recovered. In some ways, you're doing better than we are. So let's have fair and equitable and reciprocal trading agreements. And that's where he started the administration. And he has achieved that exponentially better than anyone thought he could. You know, he did it in 3 years where he rewrote the trade agreements with all of those countries. He rewrote the security agreements and got the Europeans and the Asians to contribute more for our common defense. So by putting America's interests first, you would think that's common sense, but we actually hadn't for the last 50 or 60 or 70 years, and even more so with China. We put China's interests ahead of ours for the last 25 years. We wanted to develop their economy. We thought that if they, like the Europeans, like the Japanese, like the Koreans, that once they developed a middle class and a stronger economy, they would have an open society and a more equitable trading arrangement with us. And they did just the opposite. That's why Trump has focused on China as the main issue going forward, is a better relationship with China for sure, but one that's reciprocal and equitable and doesn't allow them to continue to take advantage, frankly, of our generosity and largesse over the years.
I guess that's where you see the difference between someone putting America first versus someone who would just trust that other nations would turn out to be good actors, when we know that that's very often not the case, sadly. Mercy, what goes on here is going to be a contrast between President Trump, who is making decisions every single day about putting America first, versus Joe Biden, who you couldn't describe him any other way, really, other than as a globalist.
That's right. You know, I think it's very clear that President Trump understands that America has been taken advantage of. And so, you know, I've been in meetings with him in the Oval Office where, for example, he would look at how much foreign assistance we would be giving to nations and be like, why are we doing this? And what I liked about it, it was about changing the status quo. This is very different than as we've seen with Biden and the Obama administration, where it was very much about appeasing foreign leaders and what their needs were, as opposed to analyzing it and saying, we need to change direction. I mean, we just saw the president, for example, talk about the World Health Organization basically being tough on the World Health Organization, that we know that they themselves have basically appeased the Chinese and didn't really want to criticize the Chinese. And so what did the president say? He says, we're stopping funding, but we're going to, you know, review, assess, and figure out what the next steps are. I mean, that to me is bold leadership. Compare that to Biden, that criticized the president's actions on the World Health Organization, criticized the president's actions on trade restrictions with China, even called the president xenophobic. It is incredibly troubling to watch the Biden record in terms of how he himself really feels more comfortable with normalizing relations with China, basically having status quo trade deals, which would lead to job losses here in the US, while this president just has a very, I would say, a very strong vision of where we need to go to keep America in a strong, safe place, while Joe Biden, I think, offers that of weak leadership in the foreign policy area.
You know, I think that this should not be something we glossed over. Biden and his ilk have represented a policy of putting other countries' interests ahead of America's. Bottom line, we subsidized their security you know, we paid the most, like 75% of the common defense we paid for. In our trade agreements, we had their automobiles came into the United States with a 2% tariff tax. Our automobiles made in Michigan and in the Midwest, they went into Europe with a 25% tariff. So we put our interests second and we put other countries' interests first. The other countries have long since recovered, and it's time, and long overdue time, to put America's interests first. Not to say that we want to go it alone or we don't want allies. We sure do, but we want a fair and equitable trading relationship with them and a security situation where they contribute as well, not just freeloading on ours. So it's a fundamental reversal of what's gone on for the last 20 years that Joe Biden, as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and then after that as vice president, that was the policy that he created. He's still living in the past, and he's still advocating that going forward, which will bankrupt the country, and it won't solve America's leadership role in the world. It'll be just the opposite. It'll be handing it to China.
Mercy, you had something else?
Right. If I can add one quick thing, and I think you talked about this. I remember when the president ruffled the feathers of foreign leaders when he said, it's burden sharing when it comes to NATO. That you're going to need, other countries are going to need to step up and pay more because the U.S. has been footing the bill. And he received criticism across the board. But the reality is what happened. The countries stepped up. Many of them did. And they begrudgingly did it, but it was the right move for the United States because it really has been the other countries depending on us to protect them. And at the end of the day, when we are facing these global threats, we need the help of other nations to be able to contribute as well. And so again, he's going to get criticized by the Democrats, by Biden, for saying, okay, other nations, it's time to step up. The other thing is the Paris Climate Accord agreements. That is another area where, for example, the president knew he was going to get criticized globally, but did the right move because at the end of the day, the U.S. was going to foot the bill for China that is spending so much time polluting their country and really not, and really we would have been subsidizing China and these other nations. It is bold leadership when it comes to foreign policy, something that at the end of the day, what will Biden do? He will sign up again for the Paris Climate Agreement. He will ensure that we are weakened when it comes to NATO, and we can't reverse these strong policies that President Trump has put in place.
Yeah. A vote for Biden is a vote for putting America's interests second. Bottom line.
I think it's as clear as can be what President Trump says frequently. He says, look, I wasn't elected president of the world. I was elected president of the United States. And that's how he operates, and that's how he carries himself every single day on the job. And you've been speaking a lot, both of you, about the record of Joe Biden going back to the Obama-Biden administration. Why don't we hear from somebody who might know a little bit about how Joe Biden views the world and views foreign policy? Here is his own former Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, being read to him a portion of his own book. Let's take a look.
Still, I think he's been wrong on nearly every major foreign policy and national security issue over the past 4 decades. Would he be an effective commander-in-chief?
I don't know. I don't know. I think I stand by that statement.
Wrong on nearly every major foreign policy and national security issue over the past 4 decades. That's the Obama-Biden Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, talking about Joe Biden. KT, he's got a disastrous record on foreign policy. That's right there, according to the Obama-Biden Defense Secretary. I mean, you could start or begin a conversation talking about his vote for the Iraq War, but it doesn't end there, and it's a long list, is it not?
Yeah, I mean, he voted for the Iraq War. And then by the time we finally, 5 years later, were winning the Iraq War, he, as vice president, he did the other wrong decision, which was he got out of the Iraq. So then we lost Iraq. He had the Iran nuclear deal. He was a great proponent of the Iran nuclear deal. Well, it turns out that was a flawed deal. It didn't stop the Iranian missile program, and it certainly didn't stop the Iranian exporting its revolution to terrorist groups around the world. He was wrong about China, and that's probably the most significant place that he was wrong. But I think that it's important to sort of look, the Obama legacy, the Obama-Biden legacy, was to take the world's attention and focus on the Middle East and taking their eye off the ball to the growing danger and the growing threat and the gathering storm of China. And to me, that's the biggest crime of all. As president, and Gates was asked this question, as national security leader, strong leader, a leader has to set priorities. A leader can't do everything. A leader has to decide, this is more important, this is important, but less important. And I want to make darn sure that the most important things I've solved. And that's the biggest gripe against Biden. He wants to do everything all the time. You can't. And that's the real problem, is that he absolutely took his eye off the ball on China, and he continues to take his eye off the ball of Asia. And that's where the future of trade and commerce and security issues will be, is in Asia. And Joe Biden, again, living in the past.
Yeah, and this is when he talks about China and other decisions that he's made and different views that he's had, Mercy, he almost seems proud of it. And, lucky for our campaign, he's got a record of exactly this that stretches back almost 5 decades. And so Joe Biden versus Donald Trump, what a clear contrast on foreign policy.
Yeah, Biden in the basement equals bad judgment. I mean, there's no question that when you look at the fact, let's just take Osama bin Laden and the killing of Osama bin Laden. It was Robert Gates, Hillary Clinton, and Barack Obama that all admitted that Biden opposed the raid. Remember that under Obama Biden, for example, you saw the rise of ISIS. It was during the time that you would see so many of those killings happen in the Middle East and the growing caliphate. And it was under President Trump and his leadership and working with the Defense Department to target these terrorists and to defeat ISIS and take down the caliphate. So, you know, I always remember, and KT, we had this conversation the other day, that red line when it came to Syria.
Yeah.
And Obama Biden said, when we hit this red line in Syria, we'll take action. And they didn't take action. The weakness, the indecisiveness is very telling. And that's just in the area of, you know, of Syria, ISIS. You talked about Iran, you talked about Iraq. And so what it does is it creates instability in the world. And quite frankly, the American people have to ask themselves, do they trust Biden to keep us safe? And it's very clear that based on his record, I think it should make us all very nervous, especially when it comes to his coziness with China, that, as you mentioned, Tim, is very troubling. His family, Hunter Biden, his son, getting the contract from, you know, one of the companies in China. How did that happen? And the fact that even Biden himself admitted that China is not an enemy. I think that it's a big mistake, and it goes back to the bad judgment of Joe Biden when it comes to foreign policy.
Yeah, it's a question of judgment. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
When he was vice president of the United States and he has his son, Hunter Biden, fly over to China with him on Air Force Two, and Hunter Biden returns with a gigantic investment from the state-controlled bank in China. You know, billions. Billions, over $1 billion. The question is, when his father was vice president, what did the Bank of China, the state-controlled Bank of China, what did they think that they were getting in exchange for that giant pile of money when the fellow's father was the vice president of the United States at the time? So it all goes back to a question of judgment. There's no doubt about that. And Mercy, you just mentioned the raid to kill Osama bin Laden. You know, it was 9 years ago yesterday was the anniversary of that raid that took out bin Laden, and Joe Biden famously, and he's proud of it, was against it. And these are decisions that a president is going to have to make. President Trump had a decision of his own along those very lines, taking out Soleimani. We know that he decided to go. It was a calculated risk, but he decided it was worth the risk to take out the worst terrorist on the planet. So there you have the two different ways that these two guys look at things. Biden was proud of not going after bin Laden, and President Trump took out Soleimani and made the tough decision. Let's take a look at a couple of pieces of tape that address exactly that.
The president, he went around the table with all the senior people, including the chiefs of staff, and he said, I have to make this decision. What is your opinion? He started with the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of State, and he ended with me. Every single person in that room hedged their bet, except Leon Panetta. Leon said, go. Everyone else said, 49, 51, this. Got to me and he said, Joe, what do you think? And I said, you know, I didn't know we had so many economists around the table. I said, we owe the man a direct answer. Mr. President, my suggestion is don't go.
Last night, at my direction, the United States military executed a flawless strike that terminated the terrorist ringleader responsible for gravely wounding and murdering thousands and thousands of people and hundreds at least of Americans. Qasem Soleimani has been killed, and his bloody rampage is now forever gone. He was plotting attacks against Americans, but now we've ensured that his atrocities have been stopped for good. They are stopped for good. As president, I will never hesitate to defend the safety of the American people. So let this be a warning to terrorists. If you value your own life, you will not threaten the lives of our citizens.
It's impossible to overstate the significance of the attack that takes out Qasem Soleimani and the #2 militia leader in Iraq as well, who also never dared to set foot in Iraq during the surge after we missed him and he escaped. So this is bigger than bin Laden.
That was the former CIA director, David Petraeus, under Obama-Biden. And there you have it. There could not be two greater differences on two very similar decisions. The go or not go decision on taking out bin Laden, Biden was a not go. And on taking out Soleimani, President Trump was a resounding go. And so, KT, there you see the thought processes and the decision making of both of these candidates. One, good for America, and two, not so much.
You know, I think it's also important to remember we're electing a chief executive who's got to make tough decisions, who's got to be able to understand that sometimes you have to make a decision when you don't have all the information. And you rarely have all the information when it comes to foreign policy and intelligence issues. You make a calculated risk. Obama took that calculated risk, and there was Joe Biden saying, oh, no, 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 no. And Trump took that calculated risk because he knew that if it succeeded, it would be earth-shattering and changing the entire dynamic of the Middle East. But I also think that Trump takes these as a calculated risk. I talked to the National Security Advisor and even the president after that raid, and they both let me know that we had signaled to the Iranians, don't you escalate this, because we are going to come back really hard. So when Trump took that decision, he had a calculated risk that the Iranians, he had them right where he wanted to have them. The second thing, though, and Mercy referred to this earlier, and that's the red line that President Obama and the Obama-Biden administration drew in Syria. There is a price to be paid for threats that you don't carry out. Trump understands that. When I was working with him and he made the decision to take military action against the Syrian airfields that were having airplanes go with chemical weapons to have a chemical weapons attack against the Syrians. In other words, the same situation Obama had. Trump took the action. And when we talked about the decisiveness and what might go wrong, he also said something which struck me as, hey, this guy really understands geopolitics. He said, but it's not just about Syria. China's looking at this. Iran is looking at this. Russia's looking at this. So Trump understands the second and third order effects of this. The red line that Obama drew in Syria and then didn't carry out. China, from that point on, became very emboldened. So did Iran. Trump says, I'm taking out Soleimani. And guess what that message sent to the North Koreans, to China, to Iran, to everybody? Here is a guy who is not afraid to act and take decisive military action to protect American interests. This guy can walk and chew gum at the same time. Even though he's under domestic political assault in America, this is a guy who understands, again, putting America's interests first, taking the tough decision, and carrying out to its fruition. That, to me, I mean, I've known every president, going back to Nixon, and certainly everybody who's wanted to be president on the Republican side. Strong leadership is the single most important characteristic, because you don't know what crisis you're going to have. Who could have predicted the coronavirus crisis? The fact that you have someone who's able to take a strong position and carry it out is, I think, the single most important quality I want in a leader, in a president.
Yeah, it's all about really meaning what you say and being firm when you actually back it up. And Mercy, here we see that Democrats and Joe Biden's pals and everybody on that side were saying that when the president made the call to take out Soleimani, that this was going to start World War III, and that's all the wailing that you heard from that side. And of course, that did not turn out to be, because the rest of the world saw that President Trump was a decisive leader. But what you'll have in Joe Biden, should the United States have the misfortune of having him ascend to the presidency, is a guy who thinks about appeasement first.
That's right. And, it's interesting because I remember when I was at the White House that the media, it was the liberal media also, and the Democrats saying the president's going to start World War III. Even, I think pretty much, KT, when he just started in the first month as president.
Sure.
So this back from the beginning, where they were so concerned that the president was going to lead us into war, which is so ironic, because one of the strongest messages that the president always talks about is getting us out of endless wars. Remember, for Obama and Biden, it was a status quo. Things kind of stayed the same in Afghanistan. things kind of stayed the same in Iraq. When it came to President Trump, he really has put the military first. Not only has he invested in our military at one of the highest levels that we've seen in a very long time, I would say since the time of Reagan, to secondly, making sure, like when you sit with him and he's able to say, I have to make this call to this family who's lost a loved one. And he's like, I'm tired of making these calls. I'm tired of our guys, of our ladies, of our gentlemen getting killed, our military officials getting killed on the front line. And so he has spent a lot of time working with our national security team, with the State Department, the Defense Department, saying, how do we bring our troops home and do it in a way where we don't create instability in these different regions? And so it's why I think you've seen him focus in on the policy and really in his vision of saying we've got to end these endless wars, which I think for Americans who went through the Iraqi war, there's that war fatigue. And it was something that, although President Obama kind of promised, he didn't deliver. And obviously Joe Biden being part of that group. And secondly, I think his actions on Soleimani were so significant because it shows the contrast of Obama-Biden appeasing Iran when they supported this nuclear deal, the JCPOA, where we know that the Iranians cheated on the deal, where we know the Iranians were still building up their enriched uranium. And yet President Trump said, we're not going in this direction. We're going to put sanctions on Iran. We are going to stand with Israel, okay? And also ensure that we take these terrorists out. We know Soleimani was one who was, who definitely was involved in the killing of Americans. He was definitely involved in propping up terrorist groups like Hezbollah in the Middle East. And we're not going to allow for Iran to become this powerful nation because we know that they play such a big role, or give them relief from these sanctions because they play such a big role in ensuring that terrorist groups continue to thrive in the region and cause chaos. And that's something that I think President Trump has understood since day one.
He's also understood.
Go ahead.
No, if I could just finish a little bit of what she said, that Trump's policy is peace through strength. And that sounds like a throwaway line, but it's not. It means peace. Like, we're not going to go to war. We'll defend ourselves, but we're not going to be the aggressors. And strength isn't just military strength, it's economic strength. Trump built up the American defenses, and then he made it very clear after the Trump defense buildup, we're not going to start wars. We're going to finish wars. Boy, if you come after us, we will defend ourselves, absolutely. But we are out of these endless wars in the Middle East, which, frankly, cost billions, trillions of dollars, cost thousands of lives, hundreds of thousands of families affected for the rest of their lives. And frankly, it was Trump looking at the Middle East policies of the Obama-Biden administration and saying, look, we are tired of propping up leaders who don't like us in countries that don't matter. And Trump, because of his strong defense buildup, because, as Mercy said, he's gotten out of those endless wars in the Middle East that Biden helped start, that I think the reason is that the United States has been so successful in its foreign policy in the last 3.5 years.
Mercy just mentioned appeasement and how that is sort of the view of the United States that Joe Biden has. Let's talk about an interview that Joe Biden just gave just this past week at a local TV station in Miami talking about appeasement. He says, Mercy, that he would go back to the Obama-Biden era policy towards Cuba. And I know that you, as one of Cuban descent, care very much about that. Let's take a look at this interview that Joe Biden just gave.
Cuba policy. Would you go back to the Obama policy with regard to Cuba if you were reelected, or you were elected president?
Yes, I would. In large part, I would go back. I'd still insist they keep the commitments they said they would make when we, in fact, set the policy in place. But look what's happened. This is more than about Cuba. It's about all the Caribbean, and it's about all of our allies and friends in Latin America. And what we did when we changed the policy, we began to be open up and get so much more support within the region. And that's what we should be doing now. There's no reason to continue the policy that this president put in place.
Well, one argument could be made that Cuba should be sanctioned for its support of Nicolas Maduro and Venezuela, that if you were to restart the policies under the Obama administration with Cuba, you'd be rewarding them at a time when they're propping up Maduro.
Well, they're having great difficulty propping up Maduro, number one. Maduro's in real trouble. Number two, there's no reason why we cannot still sanction them, but fail to recognize them at all is a different thing than sanctioning them.
As we restore American leadership throughout the world, we are once again standing up for freedom in our hemisphere. That's why my administration reversed the failing policies of the previous administration on Cuba. We are supporting the hopes of Cubans, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans to restore democracy. The United States is leading a 59-nation diplomatic coalition against the socialist dictator of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro. Maduro is an illegitimate ruler, a tyrant who brutalizes his people, but Maduro's grip on tyranny will be smashed and broken.
So, Mercy, we'll take it to you since you are of Cuban descent and care very much about this, as I just said. You heard Joe Biden in his soundbite there saying that he would return to the Obama-Biden era policy towards Cuba. And he also said, well, look at Cuba. They're having a difficult time propping up Maduro right now. Well, perhaps that's because we got away from the appeasement, Joe. Please try to pay attention. It would be so wrong-headed to go back to that old policy, wouldn't it?
Well, I have to say, Tim, I think we all got a giggle when we heard that part, that they're having a difficulty propping up the Maduro government. Let's be real clear here. The Cuban military and intelligentsia, they have a significant presence in Venezuela right now. They are the reason why Maduro is surviving, in addition to Maduro's strong connections with the drug cartels in the area. Luckily, because of President Trump, fortunately, we know he's taken bold leadership and said, we're going to sanction Maduro. We're going to sanction all of the cronies who surround him, and as well as stay tough on Cuba. Why? Because President Trump will not stand with the Cuban communist regime or with the Venezuelan dictatorship. He stands with the Cuban people and the Venezuelan people. He understands their fight for liberty in their countries. This is counter to where Biden is. Okay, I remember when President Obama went to Cuba, was eating the Cuban hot dog at the baseball game, standing there while questions were asked about the human rights violations in Cuba, where President Obama clearly couldn't even answer the question. They gave the Cuban regime so much for nothing in return, for no fundamental changes in their government. And so you got to ask yourself, why would we want to go back to a policy that we know doesn't work? Under President Obama and under Vice President Biden, we saw more human rights abuses in Cuba. We saw more political prisoners jailed, and the Cuban government's ability to ensure that they continue to oppress the Cuban people. And so I say this very clearly. Bernie Sanders said that he would have reinstated the Obama-Biden policy towards Cuba. The socialist Bernie Sanders said that. And he praises the Obama Biden, he praises the Castros in saying what great healthcare system and education system the Cuban government has.
Great literacy program there.
Great literacy. And you know who agrees with him? Obama Biden. It's all the same. And so I think that we need to know that at the same way that Biden is cozy with China, he's cozy with the Cuban communist regime. He's cozy. He allows that because of that relationship, which is also causing great instability in Venezuela, where the people are starving. And so it is the wrong policy for America to support. And it's something that I think President Trump clearly understands and is ensuring that we stay strong on this issue.
Yeah, I think maybe from time to time, Joe Biden might have to be reminded that he is not running for president of the United Nations, in fact, he's running for president of the United States. Let's continue.
Tim,
Go ahead.
If I could just jump in, Bob Gates was right about Biden. He's always been wrong. Think of what would happen under a President Biden. He's going to have a triple play of bad policies. He's going to improve relations with communist Cuba. He is therefore going to allow the disastrous socialist regime of Maduro to hang on longer. And as a result of that, the drug cartels will have a new breath of life. So 1, 2, 3, keeping that perfect record of always being wrong on American foreign policy.
Yeah, the perfect record of always being wrong is not the kind of perfect record that you're looking for. Let's wrap up our sort of virtual tour around the world here and talk about China just a little bit more to put a fine point on this, as we have covered over and over again, both in this show and in talking about it. And Joe Biden actually underscores it for us quite nicely. Has never seen China as an economic threat. He has been a China appeaser, just like he has been for other trouble spot nations around the world. Let's take a look at the juxtaposition between how Joe Biden views China versus how President Trump views China.
China is going to eat our lunch? Come on, man. They can't even figure out how to deal with the fact that they have this great division between the China Sea and the mountains in the West. They can't figure out how they're going to deal with the corruption that exists within the system. I mean, they're not bad folks, but guess what? They're not competition for us.
Chinese company obtains patents for nearly an identical product, and Micron was banned from selling its own goods in China. But we are seeking justice. The United States lost 60,000 factories after China entered the WTO. This is happening to other countries all over the globe. The World Trade Organization needs drastic change. The second largest economy in the world should not be permitted to declare itself a developing country in order to game the system at others' expense. For years, these abuses were tolerated, ignored, or even encouraged. Globalism exerted a religious pull over past leaders, causing them to ignore their own national interests. But as far as America is concerned, those days are over.
So there we have it. Joe Biden wrong again. President Trump right again, this time on the issue of Cuba. And KT, you've said it over and over again. Whoever serves as president for the next 4 years is going to have a great say in how strong China emerges over the next few years as far as a world power. So it is very important that we have a president who sees China and sees what they are up to and what their history is very, very clearly, correct?
Yeah, Tim, people are always asking me what keeps me up at night, national security threats, and this is the one. China has a very obvious, they're open about it, plan to replace the United States as the dominant world power and then to rewrite the rules of order in the world, make it the 21st century will be the Chinese century, the way the 20th century was the American century. Now, they thought it was going to take them until mid-century. It won't. They now, with the coronavirus, they have accelerated their plans. They plan to, within the next 3 or 4 years, replace the United States, to push us out of the Pacific, to be the dominant economy, to be the dominant trade routes between Middle East, Asia, and Europe. They want to run that. They have something called the One Belt, One Road. They have the Made in China 2025 plan, which is to take the 10 critical technologies of the future and either buy them or beg for them or steal them and make them Chinese dominant technologies. In other words, they want to control not only the present, but they want to control the future. It is going to happen on the watch of whoever is the next president of the United States. Trump has been the only American leader of either political party in the last 20 years to stand up to China. Now, he's brought a lot of American public opinion around to his way of seeing things, but he also understands that the next 4 years are going to be the tipping point. Either China emerges from this period, controlling the technologies of the future, underwriting and building the infrastructure of the communications network of the future with the 5G network that China's planning to build. So they will control the communications network. They will control all trade between Europe and South Asia and Asia, whether it goes by sea, whether it goes by land, or whether it goes by satellite in the cyber world. They have every intention of using every trick in the books. They are ruthless in their trade, in their technology transfer theft and intellectual property theft, and ruthless in dealing with allies to tell them how they should behave, not to let them have a free opinion about their foreign policy or their own economic policy. China will dictate all of that. Just look at how they've treated their own people. They will treat other countries far more seriously and ruthlessly than they have their own. So to me, this is the only question. I don't care about a lot of little things. I care about one big thing. And this is, can the United States stand up to China? And can we maintain our technology lead and our economic prowess as we go into the next administration and into the future? Because if not, if China emerges in 2024, 25, if China emerges as the largest economy in the world, the dominant military power, particularly in the Pacific, which is where all the trade will be, the dominant technology country in the world, the dominant cyber country in the world, then it will be the Chinese world order. It won't, and China will not be America. They will not be generous to their allies. There will be no Marshall Plan in a Chinese world order. It will be China setting the rules for the entire world and the rest of the world having to follow it. I, for one, think that is the great fight of my time and my life. And Trump understands it, unlike every other political leader, especially looking at somebody like Joe Biden. Trump's looking to the future. He doesn't want that future for the world or for the United States. So I think if there's no other reason that you want to support Donald Trump, no other reason than you're going to take a second look at Joe Biden and dismiss him, it's this. Trump will rebuild the American economy. He will get us working again. He will stand up to China. He will have the guts to do it. And he alone is going to stand between us and a Chinese world order. So whatever you do, don't let Joe Biden win this election, because not only you, but your children and your children's children will be regretting it for a century to come.
Wow. Mercy, that I don't know how you follow that. But,
I'm speechless. Okay, I'm speechless. I stand up and applaud. Seriously, I just want to say
quite a convincing and clear case there. Go ahead. Give it a try.
It's going to be say no to China and say no to Biden. I mean, that's the slogan right there.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
You have to remember with Biden, it was in 2011 that he said that a rising China is a positive, he said a positive, incredibly positive development for the U.S. and the world. Just think about that. He said that a rising China is incredibly a positive development for the U.S. and the world. It goes back to the bad judgment. It's why we got to ensure that President Trump wins re-election. He understands China as the bad actor, and it's why he did what he did. I mean, when it was unpopular to put tariffs on China, because even Republicans were really nervous about it, the free traders, he put the tariffs on China. It put pressure on their economy. And so he has taken the right steps when it comes to China. It's why we've moved to a successful trade deal. And I think with Biden, you're just going to end up going in the wrong direction with him. He doesn't understand the threats that China is creating to the United States. And I think we all have to stand strong in saying no to China and yes to the U.S.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you both. Mercedes Schlapp, the Director of Strategic Communications for the Trump campaign. Thank you, Mercy, for being here.
Thanks
and
again.
KT McFarland, former Deputy National Security Advisor for President Trump. And we want to give you this opportunity. I know that you have a book that you'd like to talk about here. Why don't you take a second and tell the folks about that?
Look, this is why this book is important, because it talks about Trump's foreign policy, the arguments behind it, and it talks about China, and it talks about why Donald Trump is going to either save the United States or Joe Biden is going to coast us off to the sunset. Revolution, Trump, Washington, and We the People. You can download it right now on your Kindle, or even better, if you like the sound of my voice, there's a terrific audiobook, and you can listen to me for hours, and you don't even have to be like my husband and turn down the volume. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We hope everybody checks it out. Thank you both very much for being with us. We encourage our audience to flip over to Fox News now and watch the president at 7 o'clock Eastern in his town hall. The program is entitled America Together, Returning to Work, President Trump for 2 hours on Fox News tonight at 7 o'clock Eastern time. I want to thank both of our guests. I'm Tim Murtaugh, the communications director for the Trump 2020 campaign. Please download the app. Go to the App Store where you can find it, the Trump 2020 app, a great way to get involved in the campaign and earn points, where you can trade those points for great prizes up to and including a picture of yourself with President Trump. Thank you all very much for joining us on another edition of War Room Weekly. Until next week, we'll see you later.
In 2016, we built an unbeatable operation that changed history. Now, we unveil our next breakthrough. The exclusive Trump 2020 app. This isn't just an app. This is your source for real news, not fake news. Straight from the campaign and the president himself. This is your direct line to give input on key campaign issues. Your portal to register voters. Host MAGA meetups. Your scheduler. Your application on becoming a Trump team leader.
Join millions and get a front row seat to our virtual events. Watch Team Trump every night at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
Earn points. Get rewarded. Get the presidential photo. Oh, and did we mention this is your personal shopper too? So just to repeat, this isn't just an app. This is your tool to keep America great. Join the army for Trump and download the app today.